Your language, your traditions, and your very identity are stripped away under the guise of salvation. For centuries, Christianity, a religion rooted in love and redemption, was wielded as a powerful tool to reshape the cultures of colonized societies. From the Americas to Africa and beyond, colonial powers used the cross to not only spread faith, but to enforce control, suppress native identities, and rewrite the histories of entire civilizations. Welcome to Sands of History, where we uncover the untold stories of the past and explore the complex interplay of power, faith, and culture. If you find this journey into history enlightening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. Also, check out the links in the description to help us financially and keep these stories alive. The historical context of Christianity in colonialism. Christianity's spread across the globe was often intertwined with the ambitions of colonial empires. From the 15th century onward, European powers such as Spain, Portugal, France, and Britain embarked on a mission to expand their territories, driven by the pursuit of wealth, power, and the perceived divine mandate to civilize the world. The Catholic Church, and later Protestant denominations, played a central role in this process, providing moral justification for colonization through the doctrine of terra nullius, nobody's land, and the belief that non-Christian peoples were heathens in need of salvation. This wasn't just about spreading the gospel, it was about reshaping entire societies to align with European ideals. Missionaries, often working hand in hand with colonial authorities, became agents of cultural transformation. Their efforts, while sometimes well-intentioned, frequently led to the erosion of indigenous identities, languages, and spiritual practices. Let's explore how Christianity was used to suppress native languages and customs, wage campaigns against indigenous spiritual practices, and enforce cultural genocide through institutions like boarding schools. Suppression of native languages and customs. One of the most profound ways Christianity facilitated cultural assimilation was through the systematic suppression of native languages and customs. Language is the backbone of culture. It carries stories, values, and worldviews. By replacing indigenous languages with European ones, colonizers severed native peoples from their heritage, making them more pliable to Christian and colonial influence. In the Americas, Spanish and Portuguese missionaries prioritized teaching indigenous populations European languages. For example, in colonial Mexico, the Spanish Crown and Catholic Church established reductionist missions where indigenous peoples were forcibly relocated to be civilized and converted. Here, speaking native languages like Nahuatl or Quechua was discouraged, and children were taught Spanish or Latin through catechisms. The loss of language meant the loss of oral histories, songs, and rituals that defined indigenous identities. In Africa, British and French missionaries similarly targeted local languages. In regions like modern-day Nigeria, missionary schools prioritized English or French over Yoruba, Igbo, or other native tongues. Children caught speaking their mother tongues were often punished, reinforcing the idea that European languages were superior. This linguistic shift wasn't just practical, it was symbolic, signaling the dominance of Christian and colonial culture over indigenous ways of life. Customs, too, faced relentless assault. Traditional practices, whether dances, clothing, or communal rituals, were often labeled as pagan or savage by missionaries. In Polynesia, for instance, missionaries banned hula dances, deeming them immoral, despite their deep spiritual and cultural significance. Similarly, in colonial India, British missionaries criticized Hindu festivals and caste-based traditions, pushing converts to adopt Western dress and Christian holidays like Christmas. These efforts fractured communities, as converts were often ostracized by their own people for abandoning ancestral customs. The suppression of languages and customs wasn't incidental. It was a deliberate strategy to erase cultural identities and replace them with a Christian European framework. By stripping away these foundational elements, colonizers ensured that indigenous peoples were more likely to assimilate into the colonial order, making resistance harder and compliance easier. Church-led campaigns against indigenous spiritual practices. If language and customs were the body of indigenous cultures, their spiritual practices were the soul. Christianity's spread often came at the expense of native spiritual systems, which were demonized and systematically eradicated through church-led campaigns. Missionaries viewed indigenous beliefs as obstacles to salvation and threats to colonial control, leading to aggressive efforts to replace them with Christian doctrine. In the Americas, the Catholic Church led the charge against indigenous spiritual practices. In Mexico, the destruction of Aztec and Mayan temples was accompanied by the burning of codices sacred texts that preserved indigenous knowledge. The auto da fe, public ceremonies where heretical artifacts were destroyed, became spectacles of Christian dominance. Priests labeled indigenous deities as demons, and rituals like human sacrifice, though rare and often exaggerated by colonizers, were used to justify the wholesale condemnation of native spirituality. In Africa, missionaries targeted animist and ancestral worship practices. For example, in the Congo, Belgian missionaries outlawed traditional ceremonies honoring ancestors, replacing them with Christian rituals like baptism and communion. In some cases, sacred objects were confiscated and destroyed, leaving communities spiritually adrift. Converts were often required to publicly renounce their traditional beliefs, creating rifts within families and villages. These campaigns weren't just about spiritual conversion, they were about power. Indigenous spiritual leaders, such as shamans or priests, were often community leaders who could rally resistance against colonial rule. By discrediting and dismantling these belief systems, the Church weakened potential sources of opposition, ensuring that Christianity became the dominant moral and spiritual authority. However, indigenous peoples weren't passive victims. Many resisted by blending Christian and native practices, a process known as syncretism. In Latin America, for example, the Virgin of Guadalupe emerged as a powerful symbol, merging Catholic iconography with indigenous reverence for mother goddesses. Such adaptations allowed native peoples to preserve elements of their spirituality under the guise of Christianity. But they also highlight the immense pressure they faced to conform. Boarding schools and cultural genocide. Perhaps the most insidious tool of cultural assimilation was the establishment of Christian-run boarding schools, particularly in North America, Australia, and parts of Africa. These institutions were designed to civilize indigenous children by forcibly removing them from their families and immersing them in Christian and European culture. The phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," coined by Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in the United States, encapsulates the brutal ethos behind these schools. In the United States and Canada, boarding schools were established in the 19th and 20th centuries, often run by Catholic or Protestant organizations with government support. Indigenous children were taken from their communities sometimes by force and placed in these schools, where they were forbidden from speaking their native languages, practicing their traditions, or maintaining ties with their families. Physical and emotional abuse was rampant, with children punished for any expression of their cultural identity. Christian teachings were central to the curriculum, with daily prayers, Bible study, and church attendance mandatory. The impact was devastating. Generations of indigenous children grew up disconnected from their heritage, unable to speak their languages or understand their cultural histories. This loss of identity contributed to what scholars now recognize as cultural genocidia, deliberate attempt to erase a people's culture while preserving their physical existence. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 2008-2015, documented the horrors of residential schools, including high mortality rates due to disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Survivors reported lasting trauma, with ripple effects still felt in Indigenous communities today. In Australia, the Stolen Generations faced similar atrocities. Aboriginal children were removed from their families under policies justified by Christian notions of saving them from savagery. Missionaries and government officials worked together to place these children in Christian-run institutions or with white families, where they were stripped of their cultural identities. The loss of language, kinship ties, and spiritual practices left deep scars, with many survivors struggling to reconnect with their heritage. These boarding schools weren't just about education. They were about breaking the chain of cultural transmission. By targeting children, the most vulnerable and impressionable members of society, colonizers ensured that indigenous cultures would struggle to survive into future generations. The Christian framework provided a moral veneer for these actions, framing them as acts of charity rather than violence. Conclusion. Uncovering the past, shaping the future. The story of Christianity as a tool for cultural assimilation reveals a dark chapter in human history, where faith was used to justify the erasure of entire cultures. From the suppression of native languages and customs to the destruction of indigenous spiritual practices and the horrors of boarding schools, the impact of these policies resonates today. By exploring these truths, we honor the resilience of those who endured and continue to fight for their cultural survival. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the sands of history. If this exploration of the past has sparked your curiosity, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's untold stories. Your support keeps this work alive, so check out the links in the description to help us financially. Together, let's keep uncovering the truths buried in the sands of time.